So I'd like to welcome everybody to our February Lakeside chat, and it's looking pretty nice outside for us to be enjoying some indoor time. And tonight we are welcoming Elin O'Hara, and I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did.
Yay! She is here to talk to us about some self-care or self-love. We thought that this was a great time because people probably could really use it right now after almost a year of dealing with COVID and isolation and just a lot of different things that we haven't been faced with in the past. So I know that you have tons of information to share with us tonight. I will let you take it away, but just be aware, everybody, as usual, go ahead and unmute yourselves or ask a question if you need to, raise your hand or whatever, and we can always keep things going whenever possible. So take it away, and thank you for joining us, Elin.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I love talking about this topic, particularly because nowadays, because of, again, Christina said, the isolation that people are facing and the fact that our needs under normal conditions have really kind of taken a back seat to the safety precautions that we need to take these days. I want to start by just saying that if I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint and I won't be able to see you while I'm doing that. So if you have any questions, just jump in and shout them out, and I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint so I can see you. Okay. The other thing that I just want to tell you is that although I'm going to be talking a lot about the most effective self-care practices that people can engage in these days, there's no such thing as wrong self-care. We can only do what we can do these days. So if I give you some suggestions and you say to yourself, I'm not doing any of those, it's not a criticism. It's just maybe giving you some ideas that you could add in to what you already do for self-care. So does anybody have any questions before I get started with the PowerPoint?
You know, I was thinking of one.
Yeah.
Who do you typically work with? You know, are you working with kids? Because I know you're at SUNY Plattsburgh.
Yes.
As an adjunct professor, are you working with seniors?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of my background. My first love is library science. Both of my parents and my grandparents were librarians. So my master's degree is in library science, and I started out my career as a librarian at SUNY Plattsburgh, and I still am part librarian in my responsibilities on campus. But I got my second master's degree in mental health counseling, and so I spend a lot of time teaching social work students, human development and family relations students, and counseling grad students how to be social workers and how to be counselors, because that's sort of where I feel like I can make a difference in the world. But before, when I was in my clinical practice, before I started working full-time teaching, my specialty was college-age girls, as far as my client base goes. I have presented on self-care to a number of different constituents around campus and in our community. So I feel like the presentation is general enough to be geared to every population, not just college professionals. So
Perfect.
Did that answer your question, Christina?
It does. It does. And I just want to welcome Debbie. I saw you sneak in there. Hi.
Hi, Debbie. I'm Elin, and just so you know, Debbie, if you have a question at some point, you don't have to raise your hand, you just shout it out for me, okay? Okay. So I'm going to start sharing. One other thing I'm going to tell you, I strongly believe in destigmatizing mental health issues, destigmatizing the problems that people have in their daily lives that prevent self-care. So I'm going to be referring to myself in a lot of the examples, and I'm okay with that. And so there's no need to be awkward or anything. My life is an open book, quite frankly. You can imagine we do a lot of sharing in my counseling classes that I teach. So I'm comfortable with people knowing, personal details about myself. So, okay. All right. I'm going to start sharing if I can. All right. Share screen. Share. And Christina, can you see the title slide? Okay, thank you. Okay, so first and foremost, when I talk about self-care, I'm not talking about self-care in isolation as one component of our lives. I talk about self-care as a part of each of the dimensions of our lives. In my counseling courses that I teach, I actually cover self-care as one of the requirements for the graduate students to learn about. And the model that I use is called the the Indivisible Self model. So what does indivisible self mean? So I'm just throwing this out there. Can anybody tell me what happens when you remove a spoke from a wheel?
Whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. Okay, so that's really the crux of what the indivisible self is. When we ignore part of ourselves, the whole system can collapse. We may not recognize it as such, but in counseling, we say that stress to one system in our lives creates reactions in all of the other parts of our life. Did somebody have a question? I thought I heard a voice. Okay. So the 5 pieces of our self that we have to pay attention to from a theoretical model is we have to pay attention to our creative self. So those are the things that give us joy and meaning, the things that we create in our life, like work and pleasurable activities and things that sustain us like that. The second dimension is the coping self, and that's exactly what it sounds like. So how do we cope with stressors? Are we kind to ourselves? What do we do for self-care already? Are we accepting ourselves, imperfections and all? And then our essential self are the things that deep down are the ways that we create meaning in our lives. So I know a lot of people take strength from their faith. A lot of people take strength from cultural affiliations they belong to. So those things that provide us meaning are our essential self. Our social self is the 4th component, and the social self basically means friendship, love, making connections with others. And the social self is one of those things right now that I think that we're particularly not paying attention to out of sheer necessity. Because typically we don't hang out with our friends on Zoom. We're used to gathering in groups with people. And so it's really hard to pay attention to our social selves right now, but it's absolutely crucial that somehow we figure out a way to pay attention to that social self, particularly because in the social work field, we say that social supports are the absolute strongest protective factor that we have. Does anybody know what a protective factor means? So protective factors are those things that insulate us from stress getting to us. They literally protect ourselves from our lives, spiraling in directions that we don't want. So again, social supports are the biggest protective factor that there are. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so worried about certain populations right now. I have an elderly mother, and she can't go to she's reluctant to participate in any of the activities that the senior center would have provided because she's so afraid about doing anything in person. So she uses Zoom, but it's not quite the same thing for her because she's not a member of, the digital age particularly. So we just have to figure out ways that we can pay attention to that social self without putting ourselves at risk until we're all vaccinated. Knock wood. I'm knocking wood. I don't know if you can see me. Although I have my 2nd vaccination scheduled for next week. Yay! Woohoo! And then last but not least, our physical self. And that's pretty much what it sounds like. It's exercise and nutrition, just paying attention to our bodies. Any questions about that? Okay. Okay. So as I said before, when we ignore aspects of ourselves, that has a concomitant effect on the other aspects of our life. One example from my life, to sort of illuminate that example, illuminate that concept is, I took on the role of the chair of the social work department and the counseling department recently. Well, I'm in the interim chair. So that work role meant that I had to spend 12-hour days working for several months right at the start of the COVID quarantine. So the majority of my waking hours was focused on work. And I have a 7-year-old daughter and a husband, and I have 2 stepsons in their 20s who I basically raised. So in that sort of vignette that I just painted for you, what do you think got ignored when I was working 12-hour days? And it's okay. You can just
everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Your personal health, any kind of balance, happiness.
Yourself. That's exactly right.
Food choices.
Yes.
Candy became a food group.
Heidi, you nailed it. I don't know how you did that, but you basically, encapsulated my lack of coping in one sentence. So yeah, my little girl would say, I never get to spend time with you anymore, Mom, which made me feel like a terrible mom, right? So stress in one area of my life, work, meant that I was experiencing stress in my family life. I stopped exercising, I ate junk food, I gained the COVID-15. So all of those sacrifices came about because I was ignoring everything else that gave my life balance. So it's not just enough to pay attention to one area of your life. You kind of have to keep an eye on the other aspects as well. And I think this is particularly challenging for women, because, and that's the reason I put this quote from the counseling theorist Carl Rogers up at the top. Rogers said, "I've always been better at caring for myself and looking after others than I have in caring for myself." And I think that many of us women can relate to that, right? Because we're so accustomed, because of gender norms, to take care of everybody else at the expense of ourselves. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that, but it certainly resonates for me.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about those 5 aspects of wellness in the Indivisible Self that we just talked about, which was your creative self, your coping self, your social self, your essential self, and your physical self, if you're not sure what you're ignoring, you can just give yourself a quick assessment. So on a scale of 1 to 5, meaning you ignore it all the time, and 5 meaning you pay attention to every aspect all the time, what would your lowest 2 scores be, for instance? I know for myself, I frequently ignore the fact that I have to exercise. I have a disease called multiple sclerosis, so I really have to exercise, and that kind of takes a back seat sometimes. So if I wanted to figure out which aspects of my wellness I'm ignoring, it would definitely be that physical self, followed probably by, I don't know, my creative self. I don't make a lot of time for that either. So that's just sort of a quick scoring activity you can do if you're not sure which part of yourself you're ignoring.
And Elin, maybe now is a good time to mention that if anybody wants a PDF of the PowerPoint afterwards, we are happily able to forward it to them, and then they can, on their own, on their personal time, without having to share with everybody what their scales are, they can go ahead and do that.
And if the PowerPoint was turned into a PDF file, that would be great, because later on you'll see that that there's a link to a blank self-care plan. We're going to talk about a concrete self-care plan in a couple minutes when we get to the next slide or two. But there'll be that link that you can use to create your own self-care plan. And I'm going to show you mine as an example as well. So
great.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so as far as self-care plans go, again, there's no such thing as wrong self-care, but there are certain prerequisites for, I guess I'll call it the most effective self-care plans. And so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on these sort of guiding principles, but these are they. Your self-care plan really should emphasize your flourishing as a human being. We don't just want to survive in our life. We want to enjoy ourselves, and we want to, again, flourish. We want to nurture ourselves. I love this quote. There's a theorist by the name of Wise, and he wrote that flourishing implies inviting possibilities into our lives. And I love that. When we invite possibilities into our lives, maybe trying something new, or trying something different, we can allow ourselves to flourish.
Do you find that over the last year, most people are more in the surviving catalog than the category than the flourishing?
Christina, I think I need to talk to you about maybe you're getting your master's in counseling, because that is exactly what I would say. That's right. People in the people right now during the COVID era are merely surviving, and there's no fault in that, and there's no judgment in that. It's just the way things are.
Yeah.
There's this theorist by the name of Abraham Maslow, and he said that one of the most basic needs is safety needs, and without meeting that safety need, you can't actually progress to flourishing in the other needs that you have in your life. And so COVID's really kind of taken a lot of us back to square one in terms of paying attention to what gives us meaning rather than just what protects us. So,
for me, I think it's been a little bit of an opportunity, because I have more time to focus on some of the things that I generally neglect, like my creative self. So it hasn't been all bad.
Yeah, I would agree.
that's awesome. I love that. In counseling, we call that a positive reframe, when you kind of twist something and make it a positive situation. I love that. Absolutely love that.
Debbie, your cat's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Oh,
This is
I didn't see the kitty. I love kitties.
He likes COVID just fine.
Yeah,
There he is.
Oh, look at him. Oh.
beautiful.
Thanks.
Okay, so
Can I just jump in here,
course.
Elin?
Of course.
I think I'm coping, and I, like Heidi, maybe have more time, and I'm feeling like it's okay, this is kind of how we live anyway. But then I'm having dreams that make me realize that, oh no, you're not.
It's funny you mentioned that. Well, not funny, but coincidental that you mentioned that, because I've been having the last couple nights terrible nightmares. And while I'm not a huge believer in dream interpretation, our dreams can sort of indicate to us maybe if there's aspects of our emotional lives that we're not paying attention to, or if there's some an emotional thought that we're having that we need to pay more attention to. So I think sometimes they're worth paying attention to. So one other guiding principle is your self-care plan should really be intentional. So we want to just be purposeful about changing the things that we want to do, or we've told ourselves we should do, into things that we practice. But that assumes that we're willing to change our attitudes or practices. That also assumes that we understand that our attitudes or self-care practices aren't workable. And a lot of people don't have the insight in order to recognize when something's not working. So just paying attention to that is worthwhile. Third guiding principle is reciprocity, right? Not only do we have to take care of others, but we really should be getting something from the others that we are taking care of. So obviously, with children, we put a lot of time in taking care of them. We take care of our spouses, we take care of friends, we take care of siblings, but making sure that we are getting something restorative for ourselves in return is key. I mean, obviously, I don't expect my 7-year-old to give me something in return, but when I think about it, she does give me something in return, right? She's the light of my life, right? She warms my heart every day. So that's something that I get in return that I can focus on when I'm like overwhelmed by the amount of care that her homeschooling homework is taking, when school's gone remote. So
When I see that, I think of hugs and kisses at that age, right? Like that's,
yes.
I have teenagers. They're not giving out a lot of hugs and kisses anymore. So just.
In fact, I can't turn my laptop, but literally like 2 feet from my face, I have a "I love you, Mom" drawing to remind myself that when things get stressful, trying to get her to do her spelling sentences, that there's a reason that I'm paying attention to those things. It's the love that, as a mom, that I get from her. So, okay. So deliberate self-care activities is the 4th bullet point. So, we tend to just add things on to our day piecemeal, or when we remember, maybe we schedule a massage appointment or a pedicure. But self-care really, I don't want to use the word can't or couldn't, but self-care really, we don't want to just have it be an add-on, because when self-care is just another add-on, then it becomes one more thing that I have to pay attention to. And I don't know about you, but there's so many moving pieces in our lives. We don't want it to be just another thing. We have to be intentional about building in self-care in our normal routine so that it becomes habit. And last but not least, our self-care activities should be concrete. They can't be something like, oh, maybe I'll just sort of pay attention to my emotional needs at some point. It's got to be concrete. I'm sorry, did somebody have a question? Okay. All right. Well, if it comes back to you, just let me know. Okay. So creating a self-care contract, I like to call it a contract, is helpful, because really it's a contract with ourselves. It's a contract with ourselves to pay closer attention to our needs so that we have that indivisible self, with the 5 pieces, really like every spoke being paid attention to. So when we create a self-care contract with ourselves, there's 5 steps, which you can see on the PowerPoint in front of you. And I'm going to break those down one by one. So with examples from my own self-care contract that I created for myself, so you can see what it might look like. And not everyone's self-care plans are going to be the same because our needs are different. But you'll see how the 5 steps in the contract are applicable to everybody. So the first thing that we want to do is inventory what we're doing right. What are our sources of strength? What resources do we have in our lives that help bolster us when we're feeling depleted? So just for me, my family is a source of strength. I do a lot of work on myself with mindfulness. So sort of paying attention to the moments in my life that bring me joy, and trying to recognize those moments when they happen. I kind of have a sense of whimsy. I kind of just like when I see fun things. I love to travel. I have an absolutely fantastic therapist who basically changed my life. I'm a big advocate for therapy, and I throw that out there that I'm in therapy because I want to destigmatize people going to therapy. And I really do love my work. Obviously, I wouldn't teach students how to be social workers or family service workers or, counselors if I didn't love that. So really paying attention to the things that bolster you. long term is really a good place to start, because you know that you have things to fall back on when things get tough. Any questions about that sort of step one? Okay. So step two. So identifying the things that are our major stumbling blocks, either internally or externally, is useful. That assumes, however, that you have enough insight into the things that trigger you. And you know what? We don't all have a handle on the things that trigger us. So if you're not sure what your triggers are, maybe start paying attention to, the signs that your body sends you when you're stressed. Like if you find yourself, like I clench my shoulders a lot. When I find myself clenching, that's a sign to me that I'm under stress, and I have to stop and ask myself, why am I under stress specifically? What is it that's triggered me? Maybe if you're under stress, your heart races, or you get a headache, or you feel extra tired, or you clench your hands. Or I'm a picker, like I pick at my cuticles sometimes. That's when I know that I'm under stress. So just throwing it out there, the personality traits that I have and some of the triggers that I have are up on the screen. And again, when I list these things, I'm being gentle with myself. I'm not judging them, because oftentimes the traits and the triggers that we have were formed on very early in our lives. We call them family of origin issues. So when I look at this list of triggers, like number one, I have anxiety quite frequently. And a lot of the time that my anxiety is triggered, it's because I feel like I've done something wrong. And even if it's irrational, because I'm 44 now, and so I'm not going to get in trouble, but I still have that gut like response. If a colleague points something out to me that I've like misspelled, or I don't know, it really makes me anxious, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I did something wrong. So again, be gentle with yourself, because these are oftentimes things that, we've had since we were children. You can also see that oftentimes one of my problematic traits is I assume other people have the same values as I do. And that gets me into trouble a lot. In fact, that gets a lot, I think, of human beings in trouble. We make a lot of times assumptions that, I guess I'll almost call it a fallacy. The fallacy, we believe that other people think and behave the same way as we do. We expect them to do that because we assume they have the same values. So we can be triggered when we're like, why did my sister go and do such a boneheaded thing, right? We disagree with that because perhaps it runs contrary to our values, but everybody has different values and beliefs and productivity. So we can't measure everybody else by the same yardstick.
I would guess that people have a lot of problems here because of politics, right? Wouldn't that be?
Absolutely. Big time. Right. I get frustrated when a friend argues the counterpoint, the other side of the argument, and I have to stop and remind myself they have a different political orientation than I do, or different life experiences that have led to them having different beliefs, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what makes the United States great, right? We are allowed to tolerate each other's differences. Hopefully we tolerate each other's differences.
Yes.
One other problematic trait and trigger for me, which I think a lot of women in particular experience, is trouble saying no to people. So just one thing I'll just say about that is, if you are feeling overwhelmed because you're overextended, one of the things that you can start paying attention to in your self-care plan is setting more effective boundaries. So for instance, I don't think any of you know my mother, so I can share this example. So my mom last year wanted to come on vacation with my husband and my daughter and I, and it wasn't appropriate because my daughter was the flower girl in the wedding that was taking place on that vacation. So it would not have been appropriate for her to come on that trip because she wasn't invited by the couple who was getting married. But I was racked with guilt because I was like, oh, I don't want to say no. She's my mom. She deserves a break too. But I had to stop and remind myself I would not have normally invited her on this wedding cruise to begin with, even if, if this were a normal vacation. And furthermore, she wasn't invited by the couple. It's okay to say no, right? So when you're just feeling that yicky feeling about saying no to something, ask yourself, is what I'm saying no to, is that just good self-care? Is saying no mean that I'm going to get something that's restorative? Is saying no going to make it so that I'm not feeling a sense of depletion at the end? I think if my mom had come on that trip, I would have felt depleted when I came back. And so paying attention to that is really important. Okay, so you can see the rest of my little problematic triggers there. I'll move on. Okay, step 3 is anticipating the stressors that come up in our life. So like taking stock of how our calendar year is organized, how we maintain our social relationships, how we handle holidays, just anything stressful that happens in your life. It's important to try to take stock of them and then anticipate them. So that way, if you're anticipating the stressors that come up, you can respond to those in your self-care plan. So for instance, I during COVID, I've had a terrible time paying attention to my work-life balance. So anticipating that may continue for a while is really important to me. So I can address that in my self-care plan. Understanding that because of my, my orientation to family of origin issues and my childhood, I often care for other people at my expense, or, feel upset when other people are upset about things. I'm going to plan for those in my self-care plan. So again, trying to anticipate the stressors before they're happening is important. And then back to those first 5 self-care areas, in the indivisible self, like the physical, the creative, the coping, the essential. Maybe paying attention to the ones that scored low in your self-assessment. So for myself, I wrote down that I'm going to pay more attention to my physical self. I tend to get lost in my work when I get home, so I don't prioritize exercise in the afternoon. So planning for that and saying, I know myself well enough that I'm going to put it off if I don't do it first thing in the morning is really important. So I'm going to be intentional about better providing for my physical self. And then for my coping self, it's kind of hard to have huge chunks of time during the college's semester when I'm teaching and being a librarian. And I'm also the campus's employee assistance program coordinator. So I help other people find resources for their life problems. It makes time management hard. So rather than saying, I must carve out 2 hours in the day, which is probably not a viable option, maybe I'll just say, I'm going to just plan for one small activity during the day that I know I'm going to enjoy and will help me sort of lose myself for, 15 minutes or a half an hour. So I go for a massage twice a month. I always carry a book in my purse. I love Sudoku. Love it. I don't know if anybody likes Sudoku too. But I leave a Sudoku book in my car. At night after my daughter's asleep, I'm going to admit it, I love occasionally just binging on reality TV. Love reality TV. So, not The Bachelor though. That just doesn't do it for me. So, you know, paying attention again to the areas that you've self-assessed need improvement is important. And then last, step 5 is identifying the coping mechanisms that will best match the triggers and the stressors that you've identified. So, and that's intentional. You want the coping mechanism to match the problem you've identified. So when I'm anxious, playing with my daughter takes my mind off of it, and eventually, usually it goes away. Sometimes I meditate, and there's a specific song that I know that works for me to meditate to, which I've learned through therapy. So I do that. I prioritize therapy. I make time for that. So another problematic thing, let's just say, anger when I feel like someone has questioned my competence in some way. So I mentioned that specifically because a lot of the problems that I'm going to use the word problems, but a lot of the issues that I have with my triggers and my problematic traits are based in what are called cognitive distortions. So cognitive distortions, I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with this term, but cognitive distortions are those falsehoods that we tell ourselves because we're so habituated or so used to thinking that way that it seems true. So when we stop and evaluate the falsehoods we're telling ourselves and using to evaluate ourselves or other people, there can be a really good opportunity for change. So, for example, if, let's say, a colleague of mine tells me that she's found an error in my work, I immediately snap to, I am so angry. She is saying that I'm incompetent. So if I were to confront that distortion, really, she's not saying that I'm, a bad employee. She's just saying that I made a mistake. But it's really easy for people to personalize the feedback we get from other people and to come at issues. I don't want to use the word irrationally, but from a less reasoned standpoint.
Maybe more emotional.
Yes, exactly. Yes, emotional. I like that. Probably the reason I call it emotional reasoning. That's good.
There you go.
When I get frustrated when other people in my work don't pull their professional weight. And so immediately I get angry and I say, oh my word, those people, they are so, they're slackers. They don't care about their jobs. But that's not the case. I'm assuming they have the same work ethic that I do, which is probably not the case for many people. And I'm also labeling them like a bad person based on just this one aspect of their lives. They're not bad people. They just may have a healthier work-life balance than I do. So really stopping and thinking about the judgments that we're using to come to the irrational conclusions that we've come to can be really helpful. One cognitive distortion I want to point out, particularly because this is especially problematic for women, is the what's called all or nothing thinking. That's when we catch ourselves saying to ourselves, I must do ... or I should be ... Who says that there's something that as women we must do? Who says that there's something that there are things that we should be doing instead of what we are? Just because, just one quick example. I don't know how some of these moms do all the things during COVID that they do. I mean, baking and doing craft projects and refinishing furniture. I see these things and I'm like, oh, I must be such a slacker because I'm not doing these things. I should be doing more creative craft projects with my daughter. So catching that thinking and saying to myself, well, who says I should be doing those things? Is that realistic? Are those people on Facebook just presenting the best side of themselves? Because that gives them meaning, right? Recognizing that I'm using that all or nothing thinking is restorative to me because it sort of resets myself sort of in balance with the other people that I'm seeing in my life. So I just put in my self-care plan for items 5 and 6, when I have trouble saying no to people, or if I'm feeling extra stressed because of the nature of my workload on campus, I need to stop and ask myself, are my boundaries effective? Am I creating my own frustrations and my own stress by saying yes to things I know that I can't handle out of some warped sense of obligation to my friends or my coworkers? Setting those boundaries really helps us feel, rather than depleted, helps us feel complete. And last but not least, perfectionism, and this is one of my big ones again. So I'm not a huge sports fan. I actually really like tennis and skiing, and that's about it, and running. But for any of you baseball fans, what's the normal expected rate of success for a baseball player at bat? Let's just ballpark it. Does anybody pay attention to baseball?
I pay attention to baseball, but when you say success rate, you mean that
Like
they get a
hitting the
hit?
ball.
Their
Yeah.
batting average.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. I didn't know
Yeah.
the term, batting average. What's like a typical batting average?
Oh,
200, say.
Okay, so 200. So that means that the other 80% of the time, those baseball players aren't successfully hitting the ball. So why do we as human beings hold ourselves to such a stringent standard? I mean, I talk to people all the time who say, oh, I must be a failure because I've haven't accomplished X, Y, or Z, or I haven't finished X, Y, or Z. But again, we're imperfect creatures as human beings. Expecting perfection is really not being kind to ourselves. No one can be perfect 100% of the time. I think we're just conditioned to expect from ourselves that perfection when it maybe just doesn't exist. That's a standard that just doesn't exist. So questions so far? I know I'm moving quickly.
you did want a heads up when we hit the 45-minute mark or 50
Okay.
minutes. So we're at 6:13 just to keep you.
6:13. Okay, so I have about 5 more minutes before questions can be asked ish.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
All right.
I think everybody's been asking questions as we go. So if you have,
good.
Go ahead.
Okay. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll notice identify coping mechanisms that match your triggers is hyperlinked. That's because if you click on this link in the PowerPoint, it will take you to a blank self-care plan. So the self-care plan that you see in pink and gray with examples from my own life up in the screen in front of you, you can get to a blank one so that you can download that and maybe work on it on your, in whatever quiet time you have to do those sorts of contemplative activities. And again, you don't have to have like your final solid concrete self-care plan just off the top of your head in one sitting, because self-care is one of those iterative processes. We assess ourselves and what's not working, and then we make changes in our self-care plan, and then we do it again and we do it again, particularly in response to the stressors that we have right now because of COVID. I will probably have to redo my self-care plan after I get my second vaccination and it's taken effect, because the conditions will be different in my life once I feel safer. So.
I've got a question.
Sure.
Are people that don't have your background or a therapist able to complete this on their own? Or does it
Absolutely.
help
Absolutely. So
identify?
yeah, so the first step again is really taking a step back and paying attention to the signals your body is giving you when you're stressed. Paying attention to the signals your mind is giving you when you're stressed, like if you're obsessing about something. And then making note of those situations. That's like a good first step. And then you can just Google coping mechanisms. And there's a lot of great examples and web pages out there, particularly now because of COVID, that give examples of things that you can do to cope. I will say that Wikipedia has an awesome cognitive distortions explanation. I've actually hyperlinked that in the next slide. So if you want to take a look at the thought, like the lies we tell ourselves in our mind, some of which I put down in my self-care plan, you'll have that link for you to take a look at those distortions. You'll notice at the bottom of this last screen, so cognitive distortions is hyperlinked, and that'll take you to the Wikipedia page for cognitive distortions. I will just say, because I'm a librarian, Wikipedia isn't normally my go-to source for information, scholarly information. However, it just so happens that this Wikipedia page is actually pretty good. So I wouldn't be a good librarian unless I sort of said, don't use Wikipedia for everything.
Or to self-diagnose.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so just as a, oh, it stopped sharing. Hold on a second. I'm going to go back. Okay, can you see that last slide again, Christina?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So my last sort of gentle reminder, shall we say, is that you want to be kind to yourself during this process of creating an effective self-care plan. This takes practice, identifying problematic traits that you have, which are no fault of your own, recognizing what your triggers are. It just takes time, repetition, and cultivating insight about ourselves. So you want to be as gentle with yourself as you would a child learning a new skill, right? I wouldn't yell at my, 7-year-old for getting a word wrong when she's practicing or reading. So we don't want to, be unkind to ourselves when we're putting things into practice either. We also want to just be intentional about how we choose to spend our time. Sort of consciously allowing ourselves the space to recognize when things are working and when things aren't working, and then taking action when we recognize that something's not working is something that we can also practice. And then third, cultivating non-judgment. So being healthy enough and disengaged enough just to pay attention and say, you know what? What's going wrong right now may not be ideal, but I'm not going to be harsh with myself. I'm not going to judge myself because I'm coping as best as I can right now. If instead of going for a run after work, I have 2 glasses of red wine, which happens occasionally, I'm not going to be harsh with myself because I'm trying the best as I can right now in these given situations. And then last, when you practice identifying those cognitive distortions like the all or nothing thinking and the emotional reasoning and the personalization, I think has been one of the most helpful pieces, at least to me personally, in the years that I've been in therapy. So, so those are kind of my, sorry. So I just wanted to throw those 4 things out there because we don't want, again, this sort of creation of the self-care plan to to become an onerous activity. We want it to be something that's restorative to us, that allows us to flourish as human beings. So that's sort of all I had prepared in terms of the PowerPoint. Does anybody have any questions for me, or just, want to chat about anything related to this? I'm here, and I'm sure the rest of us might be thinking the same things or having the same questions.
Well, my question is about socializing during COVID, because I'm fortunate in that, I am able to get the vaccine a little bit ahead of some of my peers. However, I haven't got the second dose yet, and I'm nervous about, doing social things until I can, and spreading it and all that kind of stuff. So I was wondering if you had any particular thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, extroverts like myself are. Peter, do you mind if I ask, would you consider yourself an extrovert as well?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
It's just that, as you were talking about the 5 areas and so forth, and for me, there's one that sticks way out, and that would be the socialization, which I realize, and I was just hearing on the radio the other day about how there's a new book out about males in particular and their inability to socialize, and how they get lonely and all that kind of thing. And it all sounded just like me to me,
Yeah.
So as I'm thinking about that, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, yeah, but all the stuff that we used to be able to do, we can't really do now. So, and as you were saying before, Zoom is not a great alternative for trying to do that.
It's not a great alternative. And as a lifelong extrovert, I have had to really confront the distortion that I'm not going to do Zoom because it's not as good as in person. It's not as good as that face-to-face engagement that really, enriches my life as a human being. So if Zoom is the only thing that we have that allows us to socialize face-to-face-ish right now, then giving it a whirl isn't a bad idea. In fact, I have a standing every other Friday night wine date, if you will, with my best friend who lives across the border and can't come down, even if she wanted to, and even if we were all safe. So exploring those other options is really important, and finding perhaps communities of practice that that might have like online group activities is important. I know the senior center has a lot of online activities now that my mother enjoys, and using social media like Facebook. There's a lot of sort of Facebook events that that you can join in on once you find the right community on Facebook to jump in with. Those things can be somewhat restorative. But Peter, you're right when you say that it's not what we would typically use to create a sense of social support. But it's kind of the only option that we have at the moment, is utilizing those technologies.
Thanks.
Or, you know what? I'm going to do a positive reframe like Christina did earlier. If we do have people that are in our bubble or who are safe, like a spouse or a sibling or a child or a best friend who we do see, utilizing those supports is really important, because sometimes I know I find myself saying, oh, I don't want to bother them because I already bother them a lot. They don't need my problems. So sort of expanding the times when we make use of those social supports that are already pre-existing can be really fulfilling.
And I think that Peter brought up an interesting point. Peter, you're talking about getting your second dose, but a lot of other people might not have it at some point. How do people start getting back into, and will anybody even feel, normal in going back to the way socializing was before?
Oh,
what are the little steps that people can do?
I don't even know the answer to that, because now, I see on the news that now there's variants that make some of the vaccines less effective, or maybe the vaccines that we're getting are less effective for those variants. It's just a big question mark when life's going to go back to normal. And as someone who really doesn't like uncertainty, that's problematic, right? So the most that I can do is just sort of be planful, if you will, and have sort of a plan in place for once things start to get back to normal. Like, what's the first thing that I'm going to do?
Right.
Yeah, certainly try to see my best friend in Canada.
Like start small, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I probably won't be throwing cocktail parties anytime soon, but maybe just, a quick trip to see a treasured friend. Maybe that'd be a good place to start.
Yeah. Anybody else have questions out there today? No. Everybody's so quiet. You gave us a lot to think about.
Yes.
I wonder, you're right that this is good for all age groups.
Mm-hmm.
It's even, I was going through and like, oh, that's something I could share with my kids. So it even applies
Yes.
to younger people on some levels.
That's, you know what, Christina, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is actually something that I do with my daughter. Like, okay, let's figure out, you seem really frustrated. Does it feel in your body like you're frustrated right now? Let's stop and think about what we can do next time when something gets frustrated, so.
Yes, I think the skill set of reframing is invaluable. And I also think your mind can keep you well.
Yes.
During COVID, it's really been a major shift for everybody. And you can either embrace that or flip out about it.
Yep.
And the way I've dealt with it is it gives me an opportunity to get things squared away that I haven't had time.
Mm-hmm.
My office has never looked cleaner.
We did a whole newsletter about that, about one of the gifts that we've been given during this time is time. Mm-hmm. And
yes.
Yeah.
I must admit, as a librarian, I should probably be using interlibrary loan to get reading material, but I've just been going hog wild buying books on Amazon because I have so much more free time to do pleasure reading. That has been an absolute godsend, because that's not something I've had time to do for years. So that was a really good point, Heidi. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's about how you allocate your time. And I love your presentation, because it really gives you a lot of food for thought and a way to reframe and balance and create balance in your life. And I think it's a panacea to think, you can do everything. It's a fallacy.
That's exactly right.
And I think as we all take on too much, we're actually crowding out space for things that might be really important, that we carve out the time for ourselves. I think being deliberate is critical.
And in fact, I don't think unless COVID had happened, I would even realize how much I missed that time reading to myself. So in a sense, that's been a treasure that's resulted from this, knowing that I was ignoring that self aspect of self-care. So I'm so glad you brought that up, Heidi.
Then you carved it into your to-do list.
Yeah, that's right.
Build your work life around that. Let's see, I gotta read.
Let's see, read a book, watch reality TV.
Yeah.
They're both good. It depends on what kind of escape you need.
Yeah.
Visual no-brainer, or an in-depth dive into wherever you're going with your book.
When I feel really depleted, when my brain is like, I can't handle anything else, I'm like, okay, it's a reality TV night. And that's okay. I just finished binge watching Bridgerton on Netflix, by the way. It was very enjoyable.
I've never heard of it.
It's a fun one. I recommend it.
All right. Anybody else with any last minute questions? Everybody doing well and making it through this COVID time? Love seeing all your faces. What'd you say, Dolores?
Perfect.
Oh,
Excellent.
good. I'm glad.
And Christina, I love that you just checked in with everybody, because that's something that we can probably do more of within our own sort of social support network too. Just checking in with people who might be struggling.
Yeah, it's there. That's for sure.
Yep.
Well, Elin, thank you very much for providing us all this information. And if anybody would like me to forward them the PDF, let me know. I would be happy to do that.
I'd love a copy.
I would too.
Wonderful.
Me too.
Great.
All right.
Yeah,
It
I
was
would
a-
too.
It was a pleasure to meet all of you. I thank you for your attention, and hope to see you all again sometime under better circumstances, right?
Thank you, Elin,
Thanks
for
so
your
much.
time.
Quite welcome. You're quite welcome. It was
you.
my
Pretty
pleasure.
precious.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we hope to see you in March for our next one, first Wednesday of the month. Thank you. Happy
Thank you.
Valentine's Day coming up for everybody.
Yes.
Eat chocolate, self-care.
Woo!